Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom. Give all honor, all praises, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I can hear with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying and exhorting lesson. And for today's lesson, this is going to be a short exhortation in regards to strengthening thy brethren. And, this is, I guess, an aspect of essentially our culture, having a sentiment of camaraderie, having a sentiment of caring for our brethren. And this is an aspect of it that our people have essentially truly lost. They don't actually have this, because when you read about the curses within Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, it describes a nation of people when they did not hearken unto the voice of the Heavenly Father, speaking of the Israelites, when they did not hearken to the Heavenly Father, one of the consequences that you read about is the fact that they would essentially have a certain type of animosity towards their own brother, towards their own brethren, towards their own kid, right? And one of the things our people, I've noticed, they do essentially like a patch job, in terms of trying to have a certain kind of pseudo sovereignty for themselves. And by achieving that, they do that through having their own businesses. But there's a lot more to essentially success, and there's a lot more to healthy sovereignty than just having a business that's essentially booming. Because as an aspect, a lot of our people, don't seem to actually value the importance of essentially fruits of the spirit, and things that are manners, and that are essentially are intangible. And when I say that, I'm talking about it could be long suffering, it can be patience, it can be brotherly kindness and camaraderie, and those are certain things as a people we've forgotten and how to do and how to actually implement. So through Yahushua given us a template, essentially by washing the disciples' feet, and going into these different accounts, we see how this is the model and this is the template of how we're supposed to be as a people, right? And having that sort of affection, for one another. Because being around, remember, one of the things, keep this in mind, something I was thinking about is that not only when you look at being our people being mingled amongst the heathens, like it says in Psalms, I believe, that the we mingled among the heathens and learned to their works. Not only have we picked up the behaviors of idol worship, but we've also picked up the behaviors of how they essentially, how these beasts, I'm sorry, how these other nations, well, beasts basically, how these other nations behave towards one another. And it's no surprise when you go through Daniel, the 7th chapter, all those different kingdoms that you read about that Daniel prophesied that were going to come up, rise and fall, they were all they all behave as a beast. They all behave, as a matter of fact, let me get that word, since I keep saying it. Let me just pull this up here in the etymology. What is a beast? So it says one of the lower animals. It says a four-footed animal. It says a marvelous creature, a monster, werewolf. We're not dealing with. This is dealing with excuse me, a brutish or a stupid person, right? So what it, and that reminds me of Acts, the 10th chapter. So one of the things that they saw, I believe it was the Apostle Peter, if I'm not mistaken, was creeping things and four-footed beast. He saw our people essentially in a very destitute and low vibration state. As a matter of fact, let me start off with this precept in Lamentations. Hold on, let me just get this right here. Okay, this is Lamentations 4:1, and it says, "And how is the gold become dim? How is the most fine gold changed? The stones of the sanctuary are poured out in the top of every street. The precious sons of Zion, comparable to fine gold, how are they esteemed as earthen pitchers, the work of the hands of the potter," right? So they've gone from a state where, us as a people, we've gone from a state where, there's a saying in the world, um, rags to riches. We've gone from a state from riches to rags, right? So that's basically, just, what's being described here, from being in a glorious state where we've had our beauty, where we've had our healthy relationship with the Lord, and we've gone from a lower estate. We fell, you know what I'm saying? And we felt hard, right? And one of the consequences and one of the byproducts of things that have happened, from us have fallen, is us having those curses of that, essentially that evil eye, towards one another, right? But going back into the topic, I went off on a tangent there. In regards to the lesson is, really, this lesson really is more about an exhortation to strengthen thy brethren, because that is an aspect, I don't want to say it's an aspect of our culture, but it's a very important, essentially like a fruit of the spirit, and that's one of the reasons, I thought I would just actually, record this, and actually speak on it too, and to properly exemplify, our affection, like not just, for Yahweh Bashim Shai, but caring for our the hopeful elect, brothers, sincere sisters that actually listen, right? So let me see. Let me start off here. I'm just gonna flow around, and I sincerely pray that this lesson may be edifying, right? As a matter of fact, let me get that word. Let me get that word strength. Let me see what that says in the etymology. Oh, let me get that precept that actually inspired this lesson. Luke. This is Luke chapter 22. This is verse 31. Point in 32 here, and it says, "And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren." So that's really the portion, because we go through these certain agitations where, Satan, would, use certain people within our lives, within our walk, to agitate us, whether it's in our households, whether it might be at our jobs, and being able to overcome these things and actually share your experience to actually properly, essentially strengthen thy brethren through their different situations, right? Because that's another portion and an aspect of the teaching, as well as is help to bring a certain level of edification, right? And also it shows you the importance as a culture of having elders too, because that is an aspect, because a lot of our people, they make a lot of mistakes, getting hemmed up into certain situations, but because they don't actually hearken unto the understanding that's given unto them, because the scriptures talk about how wisdom uttereth her voice in the streets, and then she uttereth her voice in the chief place of concourse, because we're calling out to our people for them to understand, to come back to their culture, that you don't make the same mistakes that a lot of our forefathers have made, right? And so you can be healed, right? And your minds can be properly essentially transformed, because as a people we're broken, right? So so let me go back to here, the Sirach here. This is 37 verse 12, and it says, but be continually, one second, with a godly man whom thou knowest to keep the commandments of the Lord, whose mind is according to thy mind, and who will sorrow with thee if thou shalt miscarry. And let the counsel of thine own heart stand, for there is no man more faithful unto thee than it. Right? So, we when we gather together, we don't essentially have we don't gather together with niggas, because when you gather with a lot of these people in the world, their conversation, or rather I should say, when you go into that etymology of that word, which refers to a manner of life, their conversations are earthly, their conversations are vain. As a matter of fact, scriptures even say that Lot was vexed with the filthy conversations of the wicked, because it's on a very, very dim vibration, because they're speaking on things that are clearly carnal. They're speaking on things that are not actually conducive to life. They're speaking on things that are actually trying to hamper the importance of growth. It's not about actually trying to make themselves as better people and becoming more whole, because their mindset is on earthly things, the NBA game, the MLB game. They speak on things that are just, they're not actually trying to actually better themselves as a people, and our people are very caught up in a state where they're very, very into the mirth and the folly, right? So what do? We spend, we have discourse, we have those conversations, and we learn about the manner of life of being around godly men, right? Because that's where you actually can achieve, and get and acquire spiritual nuggets, right? Going back into the title of the lesson, when you're converted, to strengthen thy brethren, right? So and these are aspects, like I mentioned, of our culture, we've missed. Our people don't see the value or the importance of these different aspects. It's a lot more to, sovereignty than, just essentially having your own business. Because look at here, it's 2026, and a lot of our people have their own businesses, but when they're not operating on a very high frequency, being in tune with Yahweh Bashim Shai, it shows you that their understanding, according to this world, is still very fragmented. Your households are not in order, your mind is not in order, so you don't treat, that's a person. And then a person who's evil unto himself, why would a person do good to another when they're evil to themselves? You understand what I'm saying? So let me go to I was reading this in Galatians here. Let me just go to it. This is Galatians chapter 6 verse 9, and I'll read down, and it says in the AMP, and it says, let us not grow weary or become discouraged in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap if we do not give in, right? And that's an attitude. And sometimes the flesh, sometimes, sometimes, and the flesh always, wants to be comfortable, always wants to chill. But sometimes, to be spiritual, be minded, is to be able to subject the flesh and actually put our needs aside to be able to actually help and edify the body. And not just edification, I'm just using edification as an example. It could be, a certain aspect of you actually devoting your time to actually try and, counsel with somebody, counsel with a brother, or, those sorts of things, right? Or even maybe it could be even, family members who actually hearken unto you, just speaking from experience as well, right? Because, we walk in a particular fashion, right? In terms of the way we conduct ourselves is also a sacrifice as well, right? Where was I? This is verse 10 in the AMP, and it says, and so then, while we as individual believers have the opportunity, let us do good to all the people, not only being helpful, but also doing that which promotes their spiritual well-being, and especially being a blessing to those of the household of faith. So this is the importance as well of actually the edification portion, right? This shows you the importance of the edification, right? And it shows you the importance of in a person, you utilizing your gift, you walking in a particular fashion, addressing the certain things that might agitate you, or you might have experienced, and you deal with it, and you be able to share that, and that you can't go going through those experiences, you what's the word I'm looking for? You go through those experiences and you acquire those spiritual nuggets, because that's what Hebrews 12 kind of goes into in terms of chastising. You might have a certain level, you might go through a period of time of chastising, but what does it do? It yields a peaceable fruit, right? It yields works, right? And the scriptures talk about how riches don't even profit in a day of wrath, but righteousness can deliver from death, right? And because we need to be able to have a good amount of spiritual what's it called, like spiritual money within our bank account coming in to these rainy days, right? I.e. Jacob's trouble, right? Because we see the way the world is going, and we see the way these elites are planning their NWO and all that kind of stuff, right? So we need to be able to tap into something, and hope, and continue to strive towards actually trying to exemplify these certain fruits of the spirit, right? Whether it's among brethren, and whether it could be even among family members as well, who actually hearken and listen, right? So let me get something that Apostle Paul said. 1 second. Okay, this is Acts 20, verse 33. I'll just read it in the AMP just for edification. And it says here, I have no desire for anyone's silver or gold or expensive clothes. You know personally that these hands ministered to my own needs, working in manual labor, and of those of the people who were with me. In everything I showed you by example that by working hard in this way, you must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Yahushua, that he himself said, it is more blessed and brings greater joy to give than to receive, right? So, having that mentality of actually, giving. And Apostle Paul is sharing some, exhortation, because, and this is a cut also to the mentality of, a lot of the other camps as well, that charge for the edification, right? And you're essentially depriving you're depriving spiritual nutrients, to help the development of your flock and their congregation. So what does that do? It leads to a congregation that is properly malnourished. And that also starts with the importance of the name, because they don't come in a proper name. They come in a name that actually brings forth, it doesn't actually brings forth life. So that, what does that do? It leads to sheep that are properly malnourished. They're not actually filled with the proper nutrients, because on a spiritual level and as well as on a physical level, animals, as well as ourselves, we need our bodies need to be, properly filled with good nutrients, right? And if you don't have those proper nutrients, it hampers our growth, physically as well as spiritually, right? I'll read verse 35 again, and it says, "And everything I showed you by example, by working hard in this way, you must help the weak, and remember the words of the Lord Yahushua, that he himself said, it is more blessed and to bring greater joy to give than to receive," right? And this is a part of our essentially our dispensation, right? In the Levitical priesthood, one of the when you really think about it, our people indirectly had to have this sort of mentality, because back then, the tribes had received their different portions, in the land, I'm kind of going back during the time of like Joshua. And when we went into the land, the different tribes had their portions of the land, except the tribe of Levi, because their portion was to essentially administer the priestly duties in the priest's office, perform sacrifices, burn incense, so on and so forth. Anyways, the point I'm also saying this was because there were certain sacrifices, for example, like peace offerings, they used to be able to actually partake in actually eating of, right? And actually making and eating and then actually consuming those sacrifices, first fruits, because think about it. Okay, if you're a Levite back then, the Levites didn't actually have, substance. Like when I say substance, I mean like, like say for example, you have a vineyard, or you have I don't want to say essentially like a garden, to be able to plant your crops. You maybe have pomegranates, maybe you're growing figs, bananas, whatever it is. You have cattle, sheep, those sorts of physical riches. Now those things are good, but remember they didn't have that, right? So they had to perform a mighty work at the same time, right? So your sacrifice, when I'm saying this, I'm meaning like us pursuant to Romans 12 chapter, our sacrifice can still benefit, another, right? Us going through these different experiences can still benefit another, right? Think of it like that, because in this situation, in these times, we are the sacrifice, right? So, I guess I'll end off Second Peter's. Is it Second Peter's? Okay, yes. I'll go back to the KJV on this one, and it says Second Peter chapter 1, verse 5, and it says, beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to your virtue knowledge. Let me get that word virtue, actually. Let me see what that says. Because when you look at our people, the scriptures talk about how the righteous is more excellency than his neighbor, but the ways of wicked seduceth them. And being around these other nations, you pick up a lot of their bad habits. So a lot of that virtue of how we're supposed to be as a people, is lost, because we're surrounded by these different heathens, right? Like for example, you have a lot of these Elamites, they have that they have that they pay reverence to their different polytheistic gods and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking about one for example, named Kali. Now, I believe it's in Hinduism, if I'm not mistaken, but this particular god was a is I'm sorry, or a goddess is the one of the goddess of destruction, and that's one of the reasons the thuggies, right? That's where you get the word thug from, right? That's one of the reasons they behave that way, because they're paying homage to those particular gods. Now, I'm saying this to say our people have picked up this mindset and this mind frame of being a thug. Because when you type in thug on Google, it's mostly our people that come up. But people not knowing the history, it was not a thing that was associated with our people, but it's something that our people adopted through music and so-called black culture, right? So what happens? You start to become more of a degenerate plant of a strange vine, because we're supposed to be a noble vine, and a noble has responsibility of how we act towards one another, right? Um, Going back to the point of, let me see, virtue. It says arete. Let me see how they pronounce it.
Strong's G 703. Arete.
Arete, okay.
Arete.
So it says a virtuous course of thought, feeling, or action, moral goodness, moral excellence, modesty, purity, right? And it says purity too. So, Paul talks about how I've espoused you, going back into the idol worship, and also going back to the importance of culture. Paul said, I've espoused you to one husband, that you may be pure, so our minds are not focused on the different methods and the different practices of these different gods that exist within Babylon, right? So let me go back to the verse here. And it says, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, excuse me, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Yahushua Hamashiach, right? So to be able to abound in these things, to be able to exemplify these things. And you know what, if I may add this other quick point, speaking from experience as well, you might actually be in situations where you have to exemplify these different fruits of the Spirit with unbelievers, right? But, and I'm saying this because of it shows, I'm just speaking from experience, from being, having a business, because sometimes you encounter certain people, right, and they're gravitated towards you, but you don't, because you have that virtue, that moral excellence, you don't conduct yourself, and they pick up on that, right? So that's part of proper character, right? So I guess I'll leave the lesson there, but I kind of went off, here and there, discussing different things. But, I sincerely pray and hope that this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to you. Have a Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.